Hello, my name is Don Berg. The question I'm going to ask is, what's the trouble with our K-12 school system? According to the mainstream media, the two biggest symptoms are, one, the dropout rate, estimated to be at least 20% of all students, and can be as much as 50% in urban areas and among certain populations. And two, the failure of many of those who stay in school to excel according to the instructional bookkeeping required by the system. To fit this lack of attainment of certain instructional bookkeeping standards into a more familiar narrative frame, let's just call it failure to achieve. But there's a third symptom that is currently being ignored. The underappreciated additional symptom is fauxchievement. Let me tell you about my experience of high school math my sophomore year in 1984 with Mr. Schuster. I faithfully jumped through all the hoops Mr. Schuster put in front of me. I scored reasonably well on his tests, and he gave me perfectly acceptable grades. And you should know, I was in a college preparation magnet program. So I was in school with the very best students in the Long Beach Unified School District. We were expected to be engaged and accomplished learners. But in reality, me and a number of my classmates were accomplished at gaming the system, at being faux achievers. Now, flash forward to the beginning of my junior year of math. When I took the assessment of skills at the beginning of the year, I failed it so utterly and completely that my new math teacher saw no hope of my catching up. She assigned me independent study working on SAT preparation manuals for the entire semester so I could retake that test in December. She told me that she knew I could master the strategies for taking the test because my performance in Mr. Schuster's class proved that I had the ability to go through the motions without mastering the material. And my performance on the SAT in turn proved that she was correct. My math score improved 120 points, going from 500 to 620, and my English score only went up 50 points from 560 to 610. She recognized that I was a successful faux achiever, though she didn't have that term. I wasn't underachieving, I wasn't overachieving, I wasn't even run-of-the-mill achieving. I was faux achieving, doing enough to look good on the terms set by the system, but not in a way that would get me the learning benefits that are normally expected. As a faux achiever, I knew how to do the minimal amount of work to get as much as I wanted from the system. And I'm certainly not unique. Howard Gardner, of Multiple Intelligences fame, pointed out in his 2004 book, The Unschooled Mind, that a majority of people with advanced degrees in every subject are prone to failing practical tests of the most basic concepts in their field when the problems are presented to them in ways that are different from the way they were normally tested in school. So, if they don't get the problem presented to them in a format that they expect, then they cannot solve the problem. In other words, most master's degrees do not indicate mastery. They indicate faux achievement. So, the big three symptoms of the failures of our K-12 system are dropping out, failing to achieve, and faux achievement. The dropouts don't have motivation to stay in school. The failures don't have enough motivation to work the system. And the faux achievers don't get the learning benefits because they work the system with the wrong kind of motivation. These symptoms indicate that the fundamental problem in education in K-12 schooling is motivation. To be more precise, the fundamental problem is that traditional schools consistently kill intrinsic motivation. And we know exactly how they kill intrinsic motivation. They kill it by thwarting their students' primary psychological needs for relatedness and autonomy. Now, critics have been pointing this out for at least 100 years. But the data that proved they were correct was only collected over the last 30 years or so. And only in the last 3 years has evidence shown that a different pattern is actually occurring in certain kinds of schools. My psychology thesis for Reed College, which was published in the journal Other Education in 2013, was one of those studies. I looked at the patterns of motivation in a democratic school and in a homeschool resource center. In contrast to the decline in intrinsic motivation found in all traditional schools studied to date, I found that those alternative schools maintained their students' intrinsic motivation. To conclude the prepared portion of my talk, over the years, as a champion of self-directed learning, I had intuited the following belief, for which my research provides a more rigorous foundation. Every adult responsible for children must nurture them, where nurturing means supporting them to meet their primary human needs. However, we currently have a K-12 school system that consistently forces adults responsible for children to sacrifice their moral duty on the altar of instructional bookkeeping. This is wrong. And we know we can do better because a few alternative schools have already shown the way. This is the takeaway for my talk, so I'm going to repeat it. Every adult responsible for children must nurture them, where nurturing means supporting them to meet their primary human needs. However, we currently have a K-12 school system that consistently forces adults responsible for children to sacrifice their moral duty to nurture those children on the altar of instructional bookkeeping. This is wrong, and we know we can do better because democratic schools and a homeschool resource center have already shown the way.
Thank you all for your attention. Let me give you a couple of things. I'll explain the primary human needs, and then I'll talk about some of those alternatives, and then we'll just open it all up. So the 8 primary human needs. These are needs that are universal. That means they're not cultural dependent. There's well-established evidence to show that these are universal, and they are primary, meaning that they're not derived from anything else. They're basic. So they are air, oxygen actually, water, food or material nutrients, shelter, sleep, and those are all basic physiological needs. We all kind of understand that. But the ones that aren't normally recognized are competence, relatedness, and autonomy. So competence, relatedness, and autonomy are psychological needs, and they're primary. They're connected to well-being. There's no neutral, like if you don't have it, there's a consequence, there's harm as a result of that. So particularly autonomy is I focus on oftentimes in the K-12 system because that's where the K-12 system tends to be kind of the worst at it. Right now a lot of the large-scale programs that are being done, No Child Left a Dime and Race to the Bank, those are basically dictating or controlling everyone downscale from those kinds of laws. And then the exact opposite of autonomy support, which is what you would do to help someone meet their autonomy need, the exact opposite of that is control. So when you have federal laws that are dictating, controlling, you're going to have a problem getting the autonomy support to happen. And let me tell you a little bit about the alternatives that I studied. So how many of you have actually heard of democratic schools before? So actually a fair number. They are schools in which typically, one thing is that there's no universal recognized definition of what they are. However, mostly what they are is places where the main requirement of students is that they participate in the democratic governance of the school itself. In other words, instruction is optional. There's no required curriculum, there's no required classes, what's required is participation in governance. That usually means there's some kind of justice, conflict resolution processes that they use. But there's no requirement around classes. The other one I studied, a homeschool resource center, and so a typical democratic school operates like, you think of school, you think of kids coming together, they're there all day, that sort of thing. That's typical. In the homeschool resource center, it's more like community college for K-12. So these kids come in because they have an interest in learning something. So it's an organization that is organized to provide instruction. However, none of the kids are required to take any of the classes except for the fact that they choose to be there. So in both cases, instruction is optional, but the way that they organize that is fundamentally different. And there's a third option. I'm actually the treasurer for a local program called the Open Road Learning Community for Teens. So they actually are a third way that self-directed learning happens is these kids, we focus on kids for whom the school system isn't working. So they become homeschoolers, but then we facilitate their learning. And we provide a facility for that kind of open facilitation. It's not geared to providing instruction. It's geared to, actually similar to the homework project, how do you have goals and how do you pursue them? What do you need to do? And so we facilitate that process. And so for the Homeschool Resource Center, it might be self-directed by the kids, but it also might be family-directed. In the democratic schools, it tends to focus on self-direction. Is that in some schools, the parents' involvement is discouraged. Actually, is the parents they're encouraged to send the kids, but the kids are encouraged to have their life at school be their life, not created for somebody else's purposes. And then the final thing I'll point out is that another aspect of what I observed at the schools that I studied was that relatedness, another basic human need, is actually facilitated through things like the way they organize space. At the Homeschool Resource Center, a third of all of their space is devoted to non-instructional purposes. In other words, they have lounges where you can go and play foosball, and you can do things that are just about community building and supporting families to be there in the space. At it was the Village Home Education Resource Centers who I worked with, and also the Village Free School. And at the Village Free School, as a democratic school, one of the ways that all their spaces were, most of their spaces were actually furnished similar to something more casual, and what this does, like this kind of arrangement of some couches and soft chairs and things, is it encourages us to be more communal, to be more relaxed, we're not in a formal setting. I mean, this is as formal as this space probably gets. And so uses of space and the way that space is organized is one of the ways that they encourage and actually help their communities meet that basic need for relatedness. And that's shown in the way that they use space to organize their things. So given that, all that, let's open it to questions. What do you think?
I was from the Village Preschool.
Right.
Well, this sounds like a colleague of me. I was wondering if you could compare what you're talking about to Montessori and Waldorf schools. How does that fit in?
Interesting thing I like. So Waldorf was actually founded by a guy named Rudolf Steiner. Do you know why it's not called Steiner?
Yeah.
The Waldorf cigarette factory in Stuttgart, Germany, hired him to create an education for their workers' families. So, in a sense, the Waldorf is an industrial education. It was designed to be. But that actually, the implications of that is unfair to Waldorf, because it actually is something that Steiner actually had a number of ways that he felt that the industrialization of education was harmful to children, and he was right. And so the Waldorf system is based on other ways of trying to undo some of the ways that industrialism has affected education. Getting the kids to tune into nature and rituals and ways that we as people, as human beings, relate to each other. But that said, it's also a teacher-led educational process. I had friends who were at Waldorf school, and the kid who's 7 or 8 years old and saying, I want to learn to read, and actually going to his teacher and asking them to teach him to read, and they said, no, we don't do that yet. And that floored me. I don't get education. If the kid is asking for it, to me, and this is very personal, but to me, when a kid is asking for something, that means they're ready for it, and it's like strike while the iron is hot. You got to get in there and do it. Now, of course, this was a family that is willing to to just let their, he found it in other ways. So they didn't rely on the school for that. They just let the school do its thing, because that's what they do, and they do it well. But then they found other ways to let him read. Montessori is a very interesting system because they, at least the places I've seen it, and I understand Montessori can vary quite widely. Both Waldorf and Montessori schools can vary widely in how they actually end up happening in the school because of the writings. People interpret things different ways, and so it comes out differently. But what I've seen is that Montessori is great because it focuses on autonomy and encourages autonomy to a great degree early in. I don't know how it works once they get into middle and high school, because it's very uncommon in the United States to have that. But I know at the elementary levels, they focus a lot on autonomy and encouraging the kids to find their way of engaging with stuff. And I haven't seen any studies of the patterns of motivation in Montessori like the studies I did. I don't know that, I've never seen anything to exist like that, but I would be really curious because Montessori seems as likely as any other to actually have similar patterns, like where they may actually preserve intrinsic motivation as well. And so it would be great if somebody did a study like that.
What are you going to do with your work?
So I'm focused on the big level of change. Like I said, the shifting to the idea that motivation is the central problem means changing a lot of the way things work. One of the things actually we were talking about earlier with someone was that, to me, given that the problem is motivation and that the symptoms of it really come down to that kind of problems with autonomy support and relatedness support, it's like the change from miasma theory to germ theory in medicine in the 1800s, is that what actually changed and improved in medicine wasn't the daily practice of doctors working with patients. It was more infrastructure development, public health things, and things like the doctors washing their hands. Okay, that wasn't something that, one, it didn't make sense under miasma theory. Like, why would washing your hands, that's silly. Because if bad smells cause disease, and you can't smell anything on your hands, it's like, it doesn't. But when you take germ theory, then all of a sudden things shift. And what you're doing is changing some basic ways of thinking. And that's what I think needs to happen in education, is when I say kids have to be nurtured such that their primary human needs are facilitated, like they have to be able to meet those needs, then that changes the way you have to think about what actually has to happen. I'm working on a book that would actually explain this. It's a big project. It's something that I don't have a timeline for yet, but that's the idea. So from a practical sense, there is very clear stuff that any teacher, any parent, anybody could implement immediately, and that is autonomy support. That's a framework. It's very clear behavioral things that you can identify exactly what an autonomy supported behavior is versus a controlling behavior. For instance, asking a kid to do something, they don't want to do it. Okay, basic conflict. But how you handle that makes all the difference. You can handle it in a controlling way or an autonomy supportive way. It doesn't mean that you don't have the boundary that this is what you have to do. Okay, it's not permissiveness and like, oh yeah, whatever. Not at all. And it's not the controlling side. So I think that you've probably heard of the parenting thing of authoritarian versus permissive. And then there's a question of what's in the middle. The very poorly chosen name for it typically is authoritative, but it's too close to that term, so it's correct. So I think that it's authoritarian, permissive, and autonomy supportive. Okay? So, and where control and autonomy support have to vie with each other. The question is, how do you then do that? Well, you have to acknowledge that they don't want to do it. Acknowledge their negative feelings. Acknowledge how inconvenient it is, whatever it is that they're responding to. Express that the boundary's still there, and then give them information about what the consequences of not meeting that boundary are. Now, that requires you as a parent or a teacher or whoever's like making this boundary clear, that if you say you're going to do something, that has to be a statement about the consequence of it, not a threat. If you're manipulating their behavior to get them to do the specific thing, like very controlling, that's controlling. Surprise, surprise. So you have to be able to make your case in a way that says, here's what the consequences are. Even if I was working with kids this morning. It's like, so I have a 2.5-year-old, 3-year-old, I can't remember how old he is now, still in diapers, has a fever. He denies he has a fever because that's what's causing him not to be able to go to his gymnastic lesson. So I say, I get it. It's really inconvenient. I know you're really sad that you can't go to your gymnastics lesson. But the fact is you have a fever, and it's not up to you to decide whether because he's denying he has a fever. It's not up to you to decide whether you have a fever. It's the consensus of the adults that you have a fever, and therefore you can't go. And so I'm sorry it's sad, but here's what we're going to do instead, or here's what our options are. So.
I'm just kind of curious in terms of ages, when do you think children have enough logic to actually make use of that sort of interaction with them?
Logic isn't necessary.
No? Okay.
No. Autonomy support can be done with pre-verbal infants. It's a matter of okay, I as the adult have to know what has to happen, but I have to know what has to happen, in order to prevent the bad things from happening, but I don't have to be in control of everything they do. I just have to prevent them from doing the things that are going to hurt them or other people. So that is independent of what they think. But if I can give them a space that I define very clearly with my behavior and the way I organize space and things like that, for instance, like the wall socket, you have it covered so that you don't have to think about it anymore. And it doesn't have to be an issue between you and your 2-year-old or infant. It's don't make it an issue. Remove that as an issue, cover it up, whatever, and then deal with the things that actually really matter. And that's actually a lot of what democratic schools do, is they're trying to figure out what are the things that we really have to deal with. And they've eliminated the thing that academic achievement is something they have to deal with. It's not necessary. Academics, in case you hadn't noticed, in the real world, academics actually are an advantage to have those skills. The world is structured that way. You don't have to deal with it. Just let the world show up for them. The big problem I think that most schools have is that they get kids out of touch with reality. If they're in touch with reality, then they get the picture, in order to do things, I need to be able to read. I need to be able to do math. I need to do these things. And so they inherently, by the fact that they have a goal, are going to run into the world and find out, I got to have that skill, and how do I get it? And that's the intrinsic motivation actually is maintained. Let's go here and then there.
I'm a middle school teacher.
Oh, cool.
And I have a lot of friends who are really, really smart. And whenever they talk to me about education, inverted classroom, empower the children.
Right.
But I'm also in the system, and when I start to speak to some of the very, very concrete difficulties that exist within the system, that we've got OAKS, that we've got Common Core, that we got these things that if in benchmarks we don't meet, things disappear. We lose funding, we lose access, and they get very frustrated very quickly. So there's this, and there's all this kind of speaking to a fundamental shift. But then there's this lost generation of 15 years of people in an education system, if best case scenario, that fundamental shift happens, right? So, and there's not a lot of conversation on the ground level when you're doing this, in that system, to implement a lot of these fundamental, there's behavioral things,
right?
You're just speaking to. But other than that, it's really difficult.
It is really difficult. That's why the big question I have is, how do I bring this forward? Because it's difficult. Does it need to be something top down? Does it need to be grassroots organized up? And the answer is yes. You have to put it out there and see how to get it moving forward. But one of the things that was really clear about the kind of getting the background literature for my thesis and doing the study was that there's clear evidence that so there's a specific kind of meta study that looked at why is it that teachers are controlling instead of autonomy supportive, when we know very clearly that autonomy support works better. And he found 7 reasons, and 4 of the 7, I've got 8 fingers up, 4 of the 7 have nothing to do with what goes on in the classroom. In other words, 3 reasons are in the classroom. In other words, the student's behavior, dispositions of the teacher, and beliefs of the teacher, direct things. But then there's these other ones that have to do with the way society believes things, like basically if you show parents videos of controlling teachers versus autonomy supportive teachers without telling them what it's in, just to show them this behavior, they're going to believe incorrectly that the controlling behavior is more effective. That's a societal belief that they carry. There's accountability systems, like I mentioned, race to the bank and no child left a dime. These are accountability systems that dictate controlling, that encourage controlling behavior, which we know is harmful to children. We have 30 years of data showing that it destroys their intrinsic motivation and is therefore harmful. So that's the level at which something has to give. Like, in order for a change to happen, it has to be at the policy level, whether it's school policy, district policy, state policy, federal policy. That's the question I'm asking, is what does that policy need to look like in order for this to be reinforce the supportive behaviors and actually, discourage or maybe even punish the controlling and need thwarting behavior. I don't know what that answer is yet, but that's why I'm doing it. So we're going to go there and then there and then there.
I feel like I understand what you're talking about a lot better now. And
Great.
I really appreciate it. Great idea that you're bringing forward. You just brought up a second really juicy question that I'll have to ask you afterwards. The first one is more basic. So we have to support these basic human needs.
Yes.
All adults must nurture these basic human needs. Is that sufficient? Or is there more that is needed?
In the same way, thinking about it in terms of the idea that it's this shift from like a literal paradigm shift from like the equivalent of miasma to germ theory. What germ theory, what the manifestation of germ theory from 1854 to about 1954. So the reason I picked those dates is that there's a decided event that germ theory started to get some traction in 1854. But 1954 was when you could do an organ transplant. The first organ transplant in 1954. Okay, that is not possible under miasma theory. But the change was public health stuff, washing hands. It was these things that are... Actually, the medical education system had to be revamped in order to get this on a more scientific basis. There was a number of things that was going on. So there's all these kind of broad things. So that's where the change has to be coming from.
I guess concretely my question is, if you are nurturing, if all adults in a child's sphere are nurturing basic human needs, is that sufficient?
So
Or will we need to identify more?
there will be more.
Okay.
Just as, if you read this great book called Bad Medicine by David Wooten, he identified that as good as germ theory is, it really hasn't gotten medicine to be effective. What's getting medicine to be effective is actually the application of real scientific process to getting that down to the practice of medicine. That's not happened until recently. And it's in process now. It doesn't happen on a wide scale yet. So the question is, what are the things that we need? So the infrastructure, the assumptions of germ theory got us to a certain level. But there's another level. Like, for instance, what I'm advocating for is pedagogically neutral. I don't care what you're trying to teach them, and I don't care how you're going to teach them that, as long as you're supporting the basic human needs. You can do Waldorf, Montessori, Common Core. I don't care. And I don't care how it's funded. My thing is, you got to meet those basic human needs, and that's like just the foundation. And then, go to town on figuring out what kind of instruction is going to be more effective and personalizing and, people. Anyway, there's a whole. Those are those huge conversations that add a lot of complexity, but to me, they're missing the point because there's a basic level of human need satisfaction that if you don't get to that level, we're not even playing the game. We haven't entered the realm of this basic level, and that's what antisepsis in hospitals is about. It's okay, at this basic level, we have to manage kind of the germ population in the building. And then we can do some medical practice. But until we've got that, we're not doing things. We don't have the basic foundation we need. And then we can get on and figure out how to do the surgeries and how to do what medicines and what, all that other stuff. But so you're right. There's a two-part process, and just getting the fundamental human needs, that's not all the way. That's the foundation. We can't let that go. So we're going to go here and then back there. And then, yeah. So last two questions.
Are you doing anything to change the policy?
I'm trying to get these ideas out. So like I said, I've got a book in the process. I have a website, teachkidsattitudefirst.com.
But you conduct some experiments, right?
Yes, I actually am applying for a PhD program to do further research to find out what at the organizational level these democratic schools are doing that's different from what the other kinds of schools are doing. I suspect it has to do with basic need support, is that they're figuring out ways to do that, but I have to look at how do these schools meet those human needs and compare that to other schools that are traditionally not meeting those needs. So yeah, I'm continuing research, and I want to get the ideas out in some form, which is currently website and eventually books.
I wonder if you could give more examples of the difference between controlling and autonomy and supporting behavior in really charged contexts. When you have a safety issue, or when you have a lot of emotion from
Right.
the child that you're dealing with, and specific examples I think would help me understand the difference better.
Give me a context that you are familiar with that I can then riff on that.
I don't know. I mean, I guess what I think of is, I think of my friends who teach in the Chicago public schools, and one of them is actually starting preschool now on the south side of Chicago. But,
Cool.
but she for a long time taught on the south side and didn't really have a lot of resources and had a really large classroom, and was faced with safety hazards in her classroom, and was faced with her kids not having food and just a lot of things that became charged. So when they would misbehave, and you're in this
Right.
context that's top down anyway.
Right.
It's really hard, I was just curious of seeing more examples of that, so I could really understand what strategies
Right.
people would use and how to talk to kids.
So I can the autonomy support literature is it's out there. The thing is that the reason it hasn't gotten much traction is I think because of this idea of a paradigm, is that there's a way of thinking for which the autonomy support stuff doesn't really make sense. And that's what prevents it. But to address specific things, I can forward resources. This study I talked about that kind of looked at why teachers. The other thing was a very clear list. Here's controlling behaviors, and specific to instruction. Here's instructionally controlling, here's instructional autonomy support.
Or even parenting, just both of them.
It's the same, yeah.
You're kind of in a hierarchical relationship.
Absolutely.
You're dealing with kids, and
Yes.
that's not going to change. But I would be really interested to see more specific practical examples, because that's easier for me to understand.
Yep. So yeah, I would be glad to forward that. And it comes down to using informational instead of controlling language, acknowledging their negative affect, their negative reactions. The information being, here's the consequences of what's going on. If you choose this, here's what's going to happen. In particularly charged circumstances.
The consequences of a threat.
Right, exactly.
That's another thing that's not always clear to me, thinking back to how I related to my parents as a kid.
And that's the art of it, is how do you make it clear in your own mind, first of all, that my job is to facilitate them to make good decisions. But what does that mean? One of the ways I get clear about it is I talk with the kids about what my job is. My job is to manage safety and respect. Those are things. If I say this is an issue of safety or respect, you don't have choices. You don't I said, make it clear there are certain things for which I'm the adult and I'm basically in control. But that said, what I'm going to do is say, and you have ways of actually calling me on that and challenging me, but not in the moment. I set up contracts when I worked with kids personally, on a daily basis, facilitating their learning. I would say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have, the decisions that you get to make with me are all about your learning and what we're going to do every day and how we're going to do it. But if it comes down to a safety issue, and what I did was community-based homeschooling, basically. I used the community as the primary learning resource. So we'd go out and explore, and we'd use public transportation to do it. And if we get into a situation on the bus, and there's somebody with, hadn't taken their medication today, and I think that's a threat to my kids, then I'm not giving the kids a lot of choice. I'm saying what they have to do in order to be safe in this situation. But that's in the context of this contract that I have with them, where I've already told them, when it's a safety issue, I take control and make things happen. And then afterwards, you can say, that was really unfair. You shouldn't have done that. And I say, okay, great. Let's talk about that. Let's figure out how I should handle it next time. So to me, it's really having them get that I got their back, and they can challenge me. They have the power to be part of the process of doing that. And that's different, in the classroom situation, it's challenging because
It's really hard to implement.
it is. And it's because you've got this controlling administration or you've got these restrictions on your behavior as a teacher. So you have to be able to say, look kids, we don't have a choice. We're here, it's my job, it's your school, law makes you here. Now what are we going to do about that? So you're all in this together.